When I was so very kindly invited to come here today, I knew that I would be speaking about North America. My attention had been drawn there because of the fact that it's English speaking, and so it's easier for me to research their records. But coming here to Sweden, I said, well, I need to investigate a little bit more about what Scots were doing in this part of the world. And I didn't realize just how much of a connection there is that goes back hundreds of years. And so in the short time that I had to do any research at all about Scotland and Sweden was very, very short. So I have stolen some information out of a book, which is very interesting, I think. I'm going to, because it's not my research, but I would recommend that if anyone is interested in Scotland and Sweden, this book contains a couple of chapters on the connections. And it also contains a very interesting chapter that I didn't know about called The Mason Word. A whole chapter about Scottish Freemasonry and how Freemasonry was spread from Scotland to England, then to France, and then to the rest of the world. But anyway, back to Sweden. And the author of this book, I know, he's a very good friend of mine. He regularly broadcasts on BBC Radio, and he produced last year a four-part history of Scottish Freemasonry and a two-part history of Robert Burns. So it ran for 6 weeks, every Saturday and every Wednesday for 6 weeks. And that is unheard of, to get that kind of publicity about Freemasonry in Scotland, because Scotland is generally, the establishment is generally very anti-Masonic. So he did us a great favor, and he is not a Freemason. But reading his book, and I could read many extracts from his books, but I want to read you this one in particular because it's interesting. In the later 18th century, most of the prominent Scots were members of the Royal Bachelors' Club, which they founded in 1769 for billiards and undisturbed fellowship. The oldest club in Sweden, which claims to be the third oldest in the world. It is still a thriving gentleman's club. Its officials sport the Erskine tartan in memory of the founder, Thomas Erskine. End of quote at the moment. Thomas Erskine is a Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. Okay. Among the club's treasures is the famous portrait of Thomas Erskine and a story told of a visit to the club by the descendants of the Earl. On seeing the painting, the Scottish Erskine recognized it and asserted in a matter-of-fact way, "Of course, we have the original at home in Scotland." The club official begged to differ, pointing out that, in fact, they had the original, and it was the family painting in Scotland that was the copy. Erskine was only 13 years old when he moved to Gothenburg, initially working with Carnegie's, then at the age of 18, setting up his own farm with David Mitchell from Montrose, and other founder members of the club were Barclay, Kennedy, Gregg, Carnegie, and Innes. And so that's just a little indication of the influence of Scottish people coming to Sweden and creating an organization ideally for Scots. However, we're here to discuss very briefly, I'm sorry to say, very briefly, we're here to discuss Freemasonry and Sweden. Now, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that in 1780, the Grand Lodge of Scotland granted a charter to found Lodge St. Magnus in Gothenburg, and Lodge St. Magnus was known as number 199. It was number 199 on the roll of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. It seemed to have disappeared round about 1816. We suspect that it became converted from a Scottish lodge into either a Swedish lodge or some other kind of lodge. But there is a lot of activity going on around this time with not only Freemasons and Scots in Sweden, but I just discovered that there was a charter granted by the Grand Lodge of Scotland to a lodge called Le Piet Number in Copenhagen in 1747. And it is from this lodge in Copenhagen that the members come to Gothenburg to found this lodge, we think. The reason I mention this is that these are just tiny little facts that give an idea that we know that the Scots were coming across Scandinavia and founding Masonic lodges. But they did more than that. The list of members of the founder members of this lodge, St. Magnus, are apparently the same people who founded the University of Gothenburg. And this is because of the Scottish Protestant culture, Presbyterian Protestant culture, is that although they have a particular relationship with the way they worship God, the primary, one of the main driving forces behind Scottish Presbyterian Church, Scottish Presbyterian Church, is education. Education is important to the Scots throughout the world, and wherever the Scots go, they would found schools and colleges and oftentimes universities. And so here is a research project begging to be done. We have information in Scotland. I would hope that the university has information here, and we could end up finding out whether it's true that Gothenburg University is a Masonic university. That would be very nice if we could prove that. But the story doesn't stop there, because what happened was that because the Scots were restricted in terms of their ability to travel south down the North Sea, it was far easier to sail across to what is now Norway and then to go across land to Gothenburg and Stockholm, and then even to St. Petersburg in Russia, where they founded the Imperial Scots Lodge of St. Petersburg, and that was in 1795 or thereabouts. So this is the time of Catherine the Great. And those members that I mentioned who were in Washington, D.C., some of them came from America and went to St. Petersburg in Russia to build the new St. Petersburg, and they founded a lodge there, which we have the records of, and we can see the names from the lodge in Edinburgh going to America and then going to Russia. So I don't know any Freemasons from one lodge who have gone from one side of the world to the other in order to build things. Freemasons to physically build something. So there is a very interesting connection, and I'm sorry that I don't have more information. It's just I did not have enough time. But clearly, when someone says to you, and sometimes some people will say this, they will say there is nothing left to be researched in Freemasonry. Well, you can see this is simply not true. There are so many things that we do not know. We probably do not know half of what we already know. So for those of you who are interested in such things, there are a number of projects that I could give you to study in Sweden and compare to Scotland. One important thing to mention that for Swedish people is that you have probably the first non-Masonic British speculative Freemason joining a lodge in Scotland in 1651. It's by the name of Tessin, and he comes from a part of Sweden that is now Germany, Pomerania, Pommern was the northern part of Germany, was part of Sweden. He came from there in, as I say, 1651. He came to Edinburgh because Oliver Cromwell had invaded Scotland and destroyed the naval dockyard in Edinburgh. And Tessin was a naval architect of harbours, or dockyards for shipping. And so he came, he was brought by the Scottish government to Edinburgh to rebuild the naval yards for the Scottish Navy. And when he was in Edinburgh, he is recorded as being initiated in the Lodge of Edinburgh, number 1. And this is written in the minute book of that lodge. It's still there to this day. So, first Swedish speculative Freemason in the world is in Edinburgh Scottish Lodge. So, another connection with Sweden. But it's from Sweden to Scotland, not Scotland to Sweden. So there are many connections.